Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Menil Collection, and our interviewer, Janelle Montgomery, speaks with curator Michelle White about the exhibition Walter de Maria, Boxes for Meaningless Work. Now for Art This Week. Hi, we're at the Menil Collection with curator Michelle White to talk about Walter de Maria, Boxes for Meaningless Work. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
De Maria is best known for his land art, but he played around with conceptualism, minimalism, and I don't know how many other movements of the era, and he had quite a long career. Why did you decide that now was the time for a survey of his work, and how is this exhibition organized?
Well, first, at the Menil Collection, when the artist died in 2013, we started acquiring significant amounts of his works from the artist estate. And since that time, we've been doing a lot of research on the objects. We've been working really hard in our conservation lab to treat a lot of the work so they could be exhibited for the first time. So we wanted to do this show to set the stage for future scholarship of de Maria and just let our audiences know what we have here at the Menil Collection. And there's never been a survey of this magnitude done of de Maria's work. So this really is the sort of first time 5 decades of de Maria are being presented, and presented here through the lens of objects in the Menil's collection.
So the title of the show is taken from a work that dates to 1961. That's the earliest work in the show, is that right?
It's not the earliest, but it's certainly among some of the earliest. And when we started acquiring the work, following the artist's death, the early objects from 60 to 61, as the artist is moving from Berkeley to New York City, really constitutes, I think, what is really the most surprising part of this show. It is the types of works de Maria did very early on, and works that just simply haven't been a part of the scholarship.
And it was important enough that you named the show after that work.
We did
correct?
name the show after Boxes for Meaningless Work.
Because some of those ideas carry on through the next 5 decades, is that right?
Absolutely. So setting the stage with the early works as we progress through his career, through the last works he did in 2012 and 2011, they all go back to those early plywood box constructions. And I think that showcases really the revelatory nature of the show and those objects. We've had scholars, de Maria scholars, we've had scholars come that are, specialists in conceptual art of the 1960s, early minimalism, and so many people are blown away by what these early works have to offer in terms of rethinking not only about de Maria and his place in art history, at the cusp of what you were saying, so many of these avant-garde movements, from Fluxus to participatory art to conceptualism, but also more broadly how he relates to his peers at the time.
So what were some of the ideas that emerged in the Boxes for Meaningless Work that then percolate through the rest of his career?
One is certainly this idea of participation and how the artist really early on was thinking through the audience and how the viewer was no longer this, static presence, but active in the shaping of meaning. And we're talking about 1960 and 61, which is really early for thinking through these ideas of giving the audience agency, allowing the audience to participate in the formation of meaning. And de Maria is certainly at the forefront of those ideas, and we can see that through the early boxes.
There's a work in the exhibition called Statue of John Cage that's a portrait, essentially, of the avant-garde composer who used things like chance and silence as really important parts of his compositions. Other than the very obvious visual pun in the structure of the work, what are some of the other ways that piece reflects the caginess of John Cage?
The caginess of John Cage. Well, yes, it's a portrait of John Cage as a cage.
Yeah.
And also caging nothing.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is a very witty reference to musical work and contributions to avant-garde music. So Di Maria represented a younger generation, a generation that would have looked to John Cage certainly for a lot of inspiration. So we have that lineage of how Di Maria is also positioning himself. But we also, with that work, establish that Di Maria, since the very early part of his career, is thinking through the importance of music and sound in his work. When Di Maria was in graduate school at UC Berkeley, he became really involved with the Bay Area jazz scene, also working closely with Terry Riley. And he was in a rock band. He was in the Primitives, which would become the Velvet Underground. So he has his hands in a lot of like really interesting musical avant-garde communities in the early 1960s, and he's a percussionist. So thinking through sound and music as these works are being developed at that time also provides us a really interesting way of thinking about his production.
And this exhibition includes one of his sound acoustic works.
We do. We've included his 1964 composition, Cricket Music, which is essentially the sort of track of the artist drumming with the sound of crickets. And then the sort of crickets take over, and you have this very ambient chorus of the sound of insects. And we've placed that at the beginning of the show, and I'm hoping you can also sit at the ottoman and look outside while listening to the sounds of the crickets and the drums.
It's such a simple concept, and yet it's such an immersive experience when you actually are in the work.
It is, and I think it's a nice way to understand how the artist understood his works of art to be about experience, to be immersive, to be, something more than an object to be looked at.
The other work I wanted to ask about, or another work I wanted to ask about, was also from 1964, The Arch. It's quite a large piece, and it draws you in even though there's a line around it saying don't go in. How does it incorporate these ideas of ritual and the viewer's almost physical relationship with the work?
Right. I mean, I think that's, you've nailed it by even sort of talking about it as a work that invites engagement. That's more than just sort of this tactility that we find in the 60-61 pieces, that as he moves into the 1960s with pieces like The Arch, he's thinking more broadly about space, about architecture, about the relationship of sculptures to the visitor's body. When that piece was originally conceived and installed, it was for a 1965 exhibition at Paula Johnson Gallery, and that's how you would have entered the gallery and entered into this exhibition of his works of art.
Sharing a gallery with that work are a gold frame and silver frame.
Sure. So many artists at the time were looking at alternative kind of approaches to making art that weren't, oil paint and weren't coming from the art supply store. So certainly, this was also a time when Di Maria started looking at stainless steel, which would become a really important medium in his work. So the translation from these metallic paints in the mid-1960s to what's about to happen when he starts working with the stainless steel certainly anticipates what is to come.
There are not a lot of works in the exhibition from the 70s or 80s. What was going on in this period?
Well, in the 1970s was such an important moment for the artist because it's when he really gets going with realizing what becomes the lightning field, which is a work of art in the New Mexico desert that was finished in the late 1970s. We have a few sketches and drawings related to that piece in the desert. We have a really important sculpture in the show that indicates how in the piece in the desert, 400 stainless steel poles distributed in a grid 1 kilometer by a mile. So the sculpture sort of shows us how the grid works in the desert. We've also included, among other related pieces, a lot of archival material related to not only lightning field, but some of the other major pieces he was doing in the late 60s into the late 1970s.
And then I'm not really sure how to ask about this next work. It's really the series, the statement series, which I had understood to be a triptych of a yellow, a blue, and a red canvas. The way you've shown it here, the red and the blue are speaking to each other across the room. In fact, we have the blue one behind us, and the yellow work is in a separate gallery. Can you talk us through like how that whole work came together and how you chose to display it in this way?
Sure. Well, the first work of the statement series that he made was from 1968. That's the large yellow painting with the inscription, "The color men use when they attack the earth," which is quite, gives us such a wonderful image of this idea of the excavation of earth as an artistic gesture. And appropriately, that work was made for what was considered the first exhibition of earth art or land art at Virginia Dwan Gallery in 1968. And it was an exhibition curated by Robert Smithson. So it's really this like show that these terms, this idea really sort of comes into being. And the large work that he contributed to that exhibition has this very specific color, yellow, and many scholars have come to believe that the color is a direct reference to industrial earth-moving equipment, like John Deere or Caterpillar earth-moving equipment. So it's a very sort of specific, it's a work in specific dialogue with earth art from the late 1960s. We had that work on view at the Menil Collection, I believe in around 2009, and the artist came to visit us. At the time we were working with him on what would become his first museum solo show in the United States in 2011.
Wow.
Which also speaks so much to how little DeMaria's work has been seen, especially in the United States. And the artist was very inspired by the placement of the large yellow painting in our foyer that he suggested making two companion pieces, which are the blue and the red pieces that he made for that exhibition in 2011. Those two works with the inscriptions, yes, peace, yes, and no, war, no, were first displayed for that show and in the foyer as the artist had imagined. So certainly we're not beholden to this work as a triptych because it has a long kind of time span, and especially that yellow painting having a specific history in the 1960s. So that's why I decided to present it more in a sort of chronology of the development of his work in that decade and almost concluding here in this gallery with the last works that he made in his lifetime.
And he worked in threes more than once. Well, he worked in these kinds of series more than once, but it does seem like he anchored on the number 3 more often than just with the statement series. I mean, the piece right behind us, this 3 stainless steel circle, square, and triangle is another triptych, so to speak. He did some work with cars, I think, that were in triptychs. Was there something special about the number 3, or did he just find it easy to work with?
Well, I think as soon as you start analyzing how he's using numerical sequences or even ideas of geometry and sort of mathematical approaches to determining form, there's a lot of systems that he has used throughout his career that kind of pertain to a more kind of analytical approach. As I've come to understand these works, that sort of backdrop of this kind of scientific rationale is also what helps us kind of transcend these formulas or these structures as a way of kind of thinking more broadly about ideas that simply can't be understood. If that makes sense. It's the sort of balance of kind of mathematical specificity against these ideas of understanding art that transcend what we can even know
Which
or
echoes,
see.
Yeah, and that echoes, I think, something else that kind of runs through his career, which is this tension between art and things that are beyond the periphery or on the periphery of what we can see, and yet he wants the viewer's participation in the work as well. Those don't necessarily seem compatible, and yet he makes it work.
He does make
in many
it work.
ways. Yeah.
And I think a great example of that idea and how that's manifested in his work is the invisible drawings. And we have a few examples on view in the show, and they're drawings that are like almost impossible to see. They are totally frustrating. And that's the idea, right? He wanted you to sort of question what you're seeing. He wanted you to almost like sort of double your sort of perceptual senses in trying to read the text, trying to see the work, and essentially sometimes failing at doing so.
Yeah, I was looking at the landscape one.
You know, the idea with those where you just have one single word representing kind of an aspect, say, of traditional landscape painting, tree, cloud, sky, is that when you read the sort of pale letters, your mind automatically almost like fills the paper with this image of a tree, right? It's something that's not there, something that is invisible, that you, as the viewer, complete.
We want to thank Michelle for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to menil.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching. Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.